Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad that the junior senator from Alaska is in the chair because I'm going to be discussing things that are of great concern to Alaskans, but really those who care about the rule of law here and how it applies throughout all the 50 states fairly and evenly. As I mentioned just a little bit ago, I have introduced an amendment that would deal with how wilderness study areas are treated, and my proposal is one that would put a time limitation on it. And I mentioned that the amendment was precipitated by the President's announcement this weekend about additional areas of wilderness to be designated in Alaska. And I have cited to the 1980 Lands Bill, ANILCA, which I think it's good for us to have a little bit of a refresher on what ANILCA actually did. ANILCA designated nearly 60 million acres of wilderness in the state of Alaska. Nearly 60 million acres in one fell swoop. Pretty substantial. It was more than any other president had ever designated at any other time prior to that. But what we have seen since then with designation of wilderness has been, there's been this fight going back and forth. There have been areas that have been requested for wilderness study areas. But this administration has really taken it a major step forward. On Sunday, the President recommended that an additional 12.3 million acres within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge be designated as wilderness. So an additional 12.3 million acres on top of the 60 million acres that we already have as wilderness in Alaska after ANILCA. So what the President is doing here is effectively creating, again, de facto wilderness in these 12.3 million acres that will immediately be managed as wilderness. And as I've mentioned, right now there's no deadline for that, even if Congress fails to act, which I'm going to make darn certain that we do not act on this wilderness proposal that the President has advanced. But one way or another, the President gets his way because it's being managed as wilderness. But let me just show colleagues what it means for us right now. The small map of Alaska is up there in the corner. It's kind of unfair because it needs to be a much bigger map to get the context. But effectively, what the President is proposing is that in addition to the 7.16 acres of wilderness that currently exist in the ANWR area. And the ANWR area is a big refuge, big designation. But about a little over 7 million acres have already been designated as wilderness. That was done back in 1980. But what he's proposing now is effectively taking the whole balance of the refuge area and making wilderness out of that as well, so 12.3 million acres. And keep in mind that this also includes the 1002 area up on the north part, this area right here, which was specifically designated by Congress for further study of its oil and gas potential. So back in 1980, when the wilderness designation was made for the one area, 7 million acres of it, it was determined that refuge status would be afforded the balance of the area, and then the 1002 would be reserved reserved deliberately for study of its oil and gas potential. And that 1980 act was pretty clear in terms of the bargain that had taken place. And I'm going to read for the record the provision in the law that we refer to as the No More Clause. It states, "This act provides sufficient protection for the national interest in the scenic, natural, cultural, and environmental values on the public lands in Alaska, and at the same time provides adequate opportunity for satisfaction of the economic and social needs of the state of Alaska and its people. Accordingly, the designation and disposition of the public lands in Alaska pursuant to this act are found to represent a proper balance between the reservation of National Conservation System units and those public lands necessary and appropriate for more intensive use and disposition. And thus, Congress believes that the need for future legislation designating new conservation system units, new national conservation areas, or new national recreation areas has been obviated thereby." The Act further goes on to state that no further studies of federal lands in the state of Alaska for the single purpose of considering the establishment of a conservation system unit, national recreation area, national conservation area, or for related or similar purposes shall be conducted unless authorized by the Congress. So, the President is basically choosing to ignore the law as set out in ANILCA, the agreement that Alaska has contributed mightily with its share of wilderness. I will remind my colleagues, more than 1/2 of the wilderness in the entire United States of America is in our state, the state of Alaska. And thus, we wrote the law back in 1980 that says no more out of Alaska. They've found that balance. Well, this president is tipping that balance. The coastal plain holds an estimated 10.4 billion barrels of oil. I mentioned yesterday that if we can tap into these resources, we could see 1 million barrels a day coming down our Trans-Alaska pipeline for nearly 30 years. Think about what that would mean, Mr. President. 1 million barrels a day filling up that Trans-Alaska pipeline that is now less than half full. An additional 1 million barrels a day coming into this country. Right now, Americans are enjoying the lower prices of oil. But the President said, don't get used to these low prices because, they may go up. Well, they don't have to go up if we can be providing more for the benefit. If we can increase production in this country, we can theoretically decrease that cost. But we've got to be allowed to access that. And you think about the source of good-paying jobs, energy security, billions of dollars in new federal revenues. The energy security part of it is keenly important, but think about the national security. The national security. When we're producing more in this country and relying less on others, we are less vulnerable. We have greater ability to deal with other nations. Sanctions work better when we don't need to rely on that same oil that some of these nations would like to free up for other countries. So from a national security perspective, this is huge, and this is where the intersect here with the Keystone Pipeline is so interesting. That at the same time that this administration is fighting so hard to keep us from building this connect over the border between Canada and the United States, to build the Keystone XL pipeline, so that we can get that crude from our friend and neighbor to the north and utilize it to our benefit. President is saying, nope, don't want to do that. I guess he would much rather receive it from Venezuela or whomever. He says he wants Brazil to be our our big trading partner when it comes to oil. Hello, Canada. They share a border. They're our friend. They're our closest friend, our strongest trading partner. But we're going to shut them off. And oh, by the way, in that same week, let's just go ahead and take off the table permanently the greatest reservoir that we have here in the United States next to Prudhoe Bay. Let's just take that off the table too. What does that say? What does that say to other countries, that we don't care about our own energy security? I care about our energy security. I care about our national security. So again, it stuns me to think that what the president is proposing here is a measure that would take off limits permanently our ability as a nation to access the 1002 area, to safely develop this enormous potential. Keep in mind, we're not talking about accessing the full 1.5 million acres in the 1002. The legislation that has been before this Senate back in 1995 and back in 1995, yes, and 2005, asked to open up 2,000 acres. 2,000 acres out of 19.5 million acres in the whole refuge. So again, Mr. President, you know that Alaskans can do this safely. We have set and met the highest environmental standards in the world. We do it every day. Our pipeline, our amazing 800-mile pipeline, has a decades-long record of responsible production. It's carried nearly 17 billion barrels of oil safely across our state, over 2 mountain ranges, multiple rivers, in areas where we're known to have a few earthquakes. It's an engineering marvel. It has served our state and our country so well. But instead of recognizing this unparalleled opportunity that we have, we're now facing a mounting lockdown of our resource potential. And the worst part of it is, and you know this, Mr. President, it's not just ANWR we're talking about. Our offshore. Our offshore now is also going to be restricted. It was just yesterday, that the president announced that he was indefinitely withdrawing 9.8 million acres in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Seas from leasing. So you now have ANWR going to be locked up. You've got the Beaufort and the Chukchi and areas here. I don't have a map of the areas that have been taken off limits, but it's 9.8 million acres. And there's some real question that I have in my mind after reading the Interior's press release. I don't have any real comfort, Mr. President, that the 2 sales that are being proposed, one in the Beaufort, one in the Chukchi, will actually stay on schedule. The Secretary of the Interior is quoted by saying that Interior will continue to consider oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. It's not a very firm commitment as far as I can see. But when you look at it all together, between the ANWR wilderness designation and the Arctic offshore withdrawal, Alaska has lost more than 22 million acres of land and water where energy could be produced for the good of this country, and it's happened in less than a week. It's happened over a span of 3 days. 22 million acres. So what's 22 million acres? Well, got some smart guys that are looking at this. It's an area about 563 times larger than where we are here in the District of Columbia. It's about 28 Rhode Islands, and I know Rhode Island is a small state by comparison, but 28 of them, that adds up. It's about 4.5 times the size of the state of Massachusetts. This is just what was taken off limits indefinitely by this administration since Sunday. Now, my reaction to all of this has been pretty strong. And I think it's pretty obvious to anybody that would take a moment to think about it. But I'm really amazed that our president can look at Alaska and think this is what we need most right now. We're facing a pretty significant budget shortfall. And I know that our governor has spoken not only to the president, but to the secretary about Alaska's situation. And then this is what he gets as a, we'll work with you? I don't think so. This is not an indication of a federal government that wants to work with the state to develop its resources. The governor asked the Secretary of Interior for an address because he said he needed to send an invoice for the lack of any economy that Alaska would be able to generate with these actions. The one thing more than anything else that could help our state is to be able to access our federal lands and our waters so that we can fill up that Trans-Alaska Pipeline, so that we can not only help Alaska, but we can help the rest of the country. But that seems to be the one thing that this president is intent on denying. Whether it's in ANWR, whether it is in our offshore, or whether it is in our National Petroleum Reserve, where this president basically unilaterally took off about half of that in terms of availability of access. Now, I noted that when the president made his announcement on Sunday, there was a video that went out and showed beautiful pictures of the refuge area. And again, this is a big area. This whole refuge is about the size of the state of South Carolina. It's big, and there are some amazing spaces. I am the first one to admit it. Amazing spaces, just as there are all over Alaska. But I watched that video as he was flying in his airplane to go to India. And I thought to myself, the president hasn't been to Alaska, even though he says that that's not on one of his, he says he's only got 3 states that he has left to see, and Alaska's not included. So I actually asked my staff to find out. By my count, the president has been to Alaska 3 times during his administration, and he's told me that before he was president, he'd never been to Alaska. So 3 times during his administration. All 3 times, it was basically to get fuel. Now, granted, to give him credit, on one of those times, he did meet with the troops at Elmendorf, but he never went off the base. The other 2 times, it was in the middle of the night for as long as it took to get fuel. My mind, that's not visiting Alaska. That's not trying to understand who we are. We've got some pretty beautiful, wide-open skies, but when you're flying at 35, 40,000 feet looking down, that's not how you get a view of Alaska. So, outside of this short meet and greet, outside of a bargaining chip to gain support from national constituencies, he's basically viewing Alaska as a refueling stop, which is no shortage of irony here in the fact that, well, he's happy to refuel Air Force One in Alaska. He doesn't seem to want the fuel produced in Alaska. So, again, you can see, Mr. President, I can get pretty frustrated and upset about this. And part of it is because so much of this comes without consultation with us, without listening to the vast majority of Alaskans, as if, once again, we're nothing but a territory, and the promises that were made to us at statehood mean nothing. Well, Mr. President, I was born in the territory. It was not that long ago that Alaskans knew what it meant to be kind of kicked around by folks on the outside. We didn't really have a voice. We thought statehood was going to change that. We thought that statehood compact, the promises made that Alaska would be able to deliver to its citizens based on the amazing resource wealth that we had, we thought that that was going to count for something. Apparently not enough. I was a little bit surprised to read that the White House counselor, Mr. Podesta, thinks that I have overreacted to these announcements, and to others that I've been told may be coming, more to come. And he suggested that my reaction is not warranted. But I would ask any one of the 100 senators here, of the 99, think about how you would respond if your federal government woke up the citizens of your state to a message that we're going to take 12 million acres away from you and your potential to develop yourself. And then on Tuesday, we're going to take away 9.8 million acres. But don't worry. We're the federal government. We're here to help. Alaskans want to help themselves. We want to be able to exercise that independence, that free spirit that so many of us in Alaska identify with. We want to help our neighbors, help our families. But this kind of help, Mr. President, we don't need. Don't lock us up. Don't shut us out. Now, it was suggested in Mr. Podesta's comments that somehow or other, and I saw it in other press reports, that somehow or other the Interior Department felt compelled to move forward with the timing of these announcements because we were ratcheting up on ANWR. They suggested that I had introduced a bill. I haven't introduced a bill. I do intend to introduce a bill. But to somehow suggest that this was precipitated because the delegation is charging on ANWR. I want to move forward on ANWR. But it was somewhat interesting to read that. But it did kind of make me wonder, maybe the White House just isn't aware of how Alaskans feel about this. And so in the few minutes that I want to take this morning, I want to read just a few of the quotes from our state leaders that have come out since these decisions, particularly as they relate to ANWR. We've got a new governor. He is an independent. As I mentioned, he's already had the opportunity to meet with the president and talk about Alaska's issues. He's met with the secretary, had conversations. And Governor Walker says that he is angry, very angry, that this is happening. Our state Senate president, Kevin Myers, said that the impact of this decision, if allowed to stand, will harm the future of our great state and will deal a devastating blow to our economy. I spoke with our House Speaker, a gentleman by the name of Mike Chenault, who's from the Kenai Peninsula, an area where we have oil and gas potential in the Cook Inlet. They know about oil and gas. And the Speaker said, the president just doesn't get it. Or he does get it and doesn't care about the will and voice of Alaskans. That's beyond offensive. And in response to the president's ANWR announcement, Speaker Chenault also had some pretty choice words. He said, Alaska's not a territory anymore, and it's high time our federal overlords stopped trying to treat us like one. The Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, these are shareholders, these are people who actually live on the North Slope. They issued a press release stating that we are staunchly opposed to this relentless and coordinated effort to designate the coastal plain of ANWR as wilderness. This administration has deliberately ignored the input provided by the most affected people within ANWR. Colleagues, remember that when this president is suggesting that this area needs to be named or designated as wilderness, the 1002 area, people live there. People live there. Children are being educated. They're in school today. People work there. They fly in and out. They have a little grocery store. They try to make an honest living there. They subsist, absolutely. But people live there. And the quote from the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, where the corporation where these shareholders live, says, this administration has deliberately ignored the input provided both by the most affected people within ANWR. I think, Mr. President, the reason they've ignored it is because they forget that people actually live there. How can people live in a wilderness? Democratic State Representative Ben Nagyak of Barrow, who is an Inupiaq. He lives, born and raised in Barrow. He's got a great video out there. He wrote this: President Barack Obama and his lieutenants at the Interior Department will permanently harm our people and all Alaskans with his colonial attitude and decision-making. It is terrifying to see the extent by which our pleas for time and a fair airing of our views fall on deaf ears 5,000 miles away. That is a state representative born and raised in Barrow, Inupiaq, who's saying, 5,000 miles from here, you guys are making decisions without listening to us, without listening to the people. Our North Slope Borough Mayor, Charlotte Brower, also Inupiaq, didn't mince any words either. She said, these types of paternalistic executive fiats seem to be more appropriate for Andrew Jackson's administration than Barack Obama's. Pretty tough words. I'm starting to think my words were pretty mild based on what I read from the mayor of the North Slope, the Democratic state representative from Barrow. So the Mayor Brower has invited President Obama and Secretary Jewell to visit the North Slope, and she's asked them to meet with the people who actually live there before proposing these types of sweeping land designations. And if the President and if the Secretary actually accept that invitation, Mayor Brower concluded, she said, they might learn that the Inupiaq people who have lived on and cared for these lands for millennia have no interest in living like relics in a giant open-air museum. Rather, they hope to have the same rights and privileges enjoyed by people across the rest of the country. That seems like a pretty fair request to me. Even the New York Times interviewed a few Alaskans who didn't hide their feelings. One woman who said that she had voted for the president twice said, he's just alienated an entire state. And she was one who described herself as being on the fence about ANWR before the proposal, but then she added, without talking with any of us, just doing it by fiat, that's not how you lead. I think she summed it up pretty well. What the president has done, the way he's done it, it's unfair, it's uncalled for, it's unwarranted. So for it to be suggested by the counselor from the White House that my response is somehow overreacting or unwarranted, I think they should start listening to all of the people of Alaska. You and I are sent here to represent them. And I think we're expressing pretty clearly where Alaskans are coming from on this. This is wrong. It should not be tolerated. And we will not just sit back while this administration locks up our state and the potential of our people. So we have a lot more that we will be discussing about this. Again, I mentioned on Monday that there was kind of a trifecta with what we see coming out of this administration. I had been told by the Secretary that we would see this ANWR designation and that we would then see the 5-year lease sale that would take areas that had been in deferred status and completely withdraw them for an indefinite period of time, and that there would be a third announcement coming relating to the National Petroleum Reserve, the area where folks who said, don't go to ANWR, go over to NPRA, go to the National Petroleum Reserve. So the first company that tried to do so is trying to make it happen. And what this administration is doing with the mitigation costs that they're laying in front of them, I don't know. The company will determine whether it's going to be economic. But my fear is that that will be the third kick to Alaska. So it's been a bad week for Alaska. But you know what? We are not people that are deterred by bad news, by bad weather. We have a way to roll with it. I was looking at the front page of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner yesterday, and they just had a little recap of what's going on with the weather. It's like 52 below in Fort Yukon and 51 below in Fort Greely, where we base our ground-based missile defense system. We're pretty proud of what we do. We can still provide for the defense and protection of this country and do it in some pretty cold weather. Fairbanks, where I went to high school, where your wife is from, where you got married. I think the weather this morning was about 37, 40 below zero. But you know, kids are going to school. We're doing what we do up north. It's not easy, but it's an amazing place. And the people there are pretty resilient. So we've been kicked this week, but that doesn't mean we are down. It means we're just getting started.